This is the Dallas Morning News.
From the Dallas Morning News, I'm Abby McCloskey, and this is Beyond Talking Points. Today we're going to talk about two forbidden topics at once, religion and politics. And there's a lot of confusion right now about how church and state relate. According to Pew Research, half of Americans believe that the U.S. should be a Christian country, while 2/3 believe the church should stay out of American politics. Those numbers don't add up. We're hearing more about Christian nationalism, especially as it relates to the GOP and MAGA. Some are concerned about a rise in Christian persecution coming from, as it's called, the quote-unquote secular left. And meanwhile, American churches are emptying out at record rates. More people identify as religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, in America than ever before. To understand the role of church and state in America, I have Pete Wehner as my guest today. And where to begin with Pete? He served in 3 presidential administrations. He's a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He writes for The Atlantic and the New York Times. And I can't think of anybody better to discuss these issues of church and state with. I do want to offer a disclaimer up front. In this conversation, Pete and I are both coming as Christians, people of faith who've been involved in politics, and some of this conversation will be directed to the Christian community, which is a significant swath here in the Bible Belt, Texas. But this conversation is also meant to be much broader than that, because how the church and state relate is literally written into the founding documents of our country, and a better understanding of what the founders meant is a deeply important political issue, and increasingly so in America today. So I hope you'll listen in, irrespective of what you believe. Pete, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a delight to be with you. Thanks for having me on, Abby.
And there's so much to talk about, but I know our listeners would love to hear a little bit about your journey into politics that brought you to where you are today.
Sure. I was born in Dallas, grew up in Washington State. Formative years were there on the east side of the state, went to University of Washington. And my major was political science, and politics interested me since my teen years, not obsessively so. I cared more about sports and other things.
But, so you were normal, you're saying?
That's
good.
Yeah. At least I was not extremely abnormal. We'll put it that way. And so I remember as a kid having conversations with my parents about politics, world affairs. They were interested in those kinds of things. They were not ideological. They tended toward conservative and Republican politics, but not rigidly or dogmatically so. Went to University of Washington, did some internships in Olympia when I was a junior for Washington State Senator, and then I came out to Washington, D.C. my senior year, did an internship at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I didn't know what my future would bring. I'd assumed when I came out here that I would return to Washington State, probably Seattle. Maybe I would go to law school, though I wasn't sure. But I got some jobs out here, think tank jobs, and a big, maybe the most significant event early on in my career was when I was hired by William Bennett, who was then Secretary of Education in the Reagan administration, to be a speechwriter. And so I joined Bill and worked with him through the 90s, a place called Empower America, which was Bill Bennett, Gene Kirkpatrick, and Jack Kemp, who were stars in the conservative constellation at that time. And then I was hired as Deputy Director of Speechwriting for President Bush. The person that I knew best was Michael Gerson, who was his chief speechwriter and one of his top advisors. Mike and I were extremely close. And so I was in the Bush administration as Deputy Director of Speechwriting for all of 2001, so during the 9/11, and most of 2002. And then I became director of something called the Office of Strategic Initiatives, which was a kind of in-house White House think tank. And I did that up until 2007, left, and since then have returned to the think tank world, the world of ideas, public policy and writing. And I'm now at the Trinity Forum, and I write for the Atlantic magazine and the New York Times. I'm a contributing writer to both. So that's a relatively brief summary of what is now a longish career.
And Pete, were you always so forthright about your Christian faith in the political context, or is that something that's evolved?
I always have been forthright about it. You know, my own Christian journey, I started out as a or I began to explore Christianity in my high school years. I really don't have a memory of going to church when I was young. My parents were not particularly religious. And I began this journey with a friend of mine, which was really intellectual, based very much on inquiry. Is this true? How do we know it's true? And then wrestling with some of the perennial questions about faith. So faith didn't come easily to me, and it was a longish journey. But I was always public about my faith. In fact, I think the first thing that I ever had published anywhere was at my hometown newspaper, the Tri-City Herald. And interestingly, apropos our conversation, a person, his last name was Mays, and he had written basically twinning the Christian faith and the Reagan agenda. So this would have been this would have been Christmas of 1980, and saying that essentially a Christian would have to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, be in favor of the Second Amendment, increase in defense spending, and so forth. And that troubled me. And so I wrote why I thought that was wrong. And my final sentence of that piece in the Tri-City Herald was that Christ lived and died for all people, Republicans, independents, and maybe even a few Democrats. So that
we
was
should just end the podcast here then, Pete.
Yeah. So that was a long time ago. And I've written about faith and politics, the intersection of them. Michael Gerson and I wrote a book in 2011 called City Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. And I've written essays on it. And then I've written quite a number of essays which have nothing to do with politics. They're simply reflections on faith and theology. And most of those I've written for the New York Times, some for the Atlantic. And so, faith has been, pretty central to who I am. And my editors and those outlets have been terrific about supporting me and encouraging me to write about those things. And I talk pretty easily about them.
Well, I love that. And I want to talk about the intersection of church and state with you today. And, this isn't a typical campaign briefing. The other topics we're talking about, abortion, the economy, the budget, lend themselves more to the traditional policy issues. But increasingly, I think it's something that we need to get a handle on this election cycle for all sorts of reasons that we'll get into. But I want to start at the beginning because it kind of undergirds where we're going. Was America founded as a Christian nation?
No, it wasn't. Now I'll expand a little bit on it. Christianity certainly had an influence on the founding of America. I mean, before America was founded in 1776, the previous century, the Puritans left Europe, England, in 1630, and 20,000 or so came here. They were escaping religious persecution on the European continent, so they came to America as a kind of refuge from religious persecution. And in terms of the American founding, John Locke, the British philosopher, was an enormous, probably the central intellectual and political figure in terms of influencing the American founders. And Europe had experienced 2 centuries of religious wars. And so Locke was very committed to a pluralistic society and to ensuring that faith had a private the faith was given room in the private sphere to flourish, but not publicly, not to have the state establish a church or a religion. And of course, we have that in the Constitution, no establishment clause. So the idea of the founders, the very beginning of America, was to try and separate religion and government, so the government would not sanction one faith or one denomination over another.
I just want to clarify a bit on that turn here with the separation of church and state. Just to clarify, so it's not that the church should never be involved or your religious view should never be involved with public affairs. It's that the government's not picking one specific religious view and having that be institutionalized in national affairs. Or again, how would you help? Because I think there's a lot of confusion around church and state. And if it means there's a total divorce of both, or are they like wedded together? Kind of, how should we think about that? And pluralism is getting to it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So what I just described was one side of the coin. The flip side of that coin is that almost to a person, the founders respected religion and felt that religion was central to the flourishing of a republic, because they believed that morality and virtue needed to be grounded in religious faith. Then the founders themselves were people of different faiths. Some of them were deists. Some of them were Christian. Some of them were Christians of different denomination and different views. But if you read what they said, and this really I think was authentic to them, is that they believed that that faith and was an anchor for America, because of what they believed was the conjoining of faith and morality. So they were very respectful of faith, and they didn't want the government to persecute people of faith. So they didn't want to favor religion, and they didn't want to disfavor religion. And really, American history has been the sort of the push and the pull, and the tug of war that's been going on. But the different sides, whether they're the religious zealots or the secularists, tend to emphasize one at the exclusion of other, and in many cases, I think they distort history in order to promote their particular narrative. So it's no establishment, but respect for religion and non-discrimination against people of the religious faith. And I'd say beyond that, we can talk more about it. But certainly the notion that people would bring their faith and their religious values into public life, how they vote, how they think through issues, that's absolutely legitimate, and the founders fully endorse those views.
Well, that's super helpful. And I want to talk about how that relates to our modern American politics and even the current presidential campaigns and political parties. And I want to start on the right with Trump and the rise of Christian nationalism within the GOP, and do kind of what is this reacting to? What's driving it? What are the dangers of it?
Yeah, it's in terms of Christian nationalism, what's driving it? I think it's a combination of factors. One is that it's the manifestation of a lot of resentment and grievances the people of the Christian faith, many people of the Christian faith, have had. It's built up over decades. It's a sense that elite culture had looked down on people of faith, patronized them, condescended them, and in some cases discriminated against them. And this created a kind of cauldron of bitterness and anger and resentment. And this is an attempt by some people of the Christian faith, or who at least claim to be Christians, to flex their muscles and to assert power, in some cases to try and assert dominance. So that is what I think is driving it. The term Christian nationalism is a pretty loose term, and there are different ways, I think, to understand it. One is a more benign way, and one is a more malignant interpretation. The more benign interpretation, I would say, is Christian nationalism as a sort of civil religion, a patriotic pride. And the idea is that people bring faith into the public square. And that is completely fine from my perspective. And that really has been a feature of America throughout its history, and I don't think it's been particularly problematic. So it's a term that's used, I think, to try to convey that Christianity deserves respect.
Yeah.
And the notion that we have certain beliefs that are formed by Christianity, by the Bible, and we want to have room to express those beliefs and to promote the views, public policies that we think are manifestations of those beliefs. That's as I said, the benign interpretation. I think the more malignant interpretation is it is a synonym for Christian supremacy, and it's characterized by a lot of conspiracy theories, even the abuse of power. It's the notion that Christians deserve a privileged place in society and that you use coercive means to advance that agenda. And it's a barely disguised Christian primacy in law and politics. And so you see that in some states. It's playing out. You have some national leaders like Josh Hawley, who's a senator from Missouri, who gave a speech in the summer where he said that Christian nationalism founded American democracy, which is absurd. And then there's a effort that's led by Michael Flynn and Roger Stone and Mike Lindell and to some extent Eric Trump, which is part of the MAGA world, Trump world, and it's called the Reawaken America Tour. And so they're going, it says a Pentecostal influence, and they're going around the country, nation, holding pretty significant large gatherings. It's kind of below the radar of much of the media because it's a world that they don't really understand. But if you go to those conferences or read about them or observe what those people say, that I think is a very dangerous thing. It's about power. It's about control. It's about domination. So when people use the term Christian nationalism, I think you need to probe a little bit and see what do you mean by Christian nationalism? How do you see it playing out?
That's really helpful. So among some conservatives, a lot, I think, there's this other side of the coin. There's this belief that Democrats are going to take away religious liberties, such as the accreditation of Christian colleges. I'm a Wheaton grad, or tax benefits that churches might receive. And, we saw this with Little Sisters of the Poor being required to provide birth control and contraception with the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court ended up deeming this unconstitutional, or, kind of deep in the weeds, the recent Build Back Better bill under Joe Biden excluded support for faith-based providers who actually run a ton of childcare centers. This cancellation of people who hold to Judeo-Christian traditional understandings of marriage and thoughts that maybe closing the churches during COVID was politically motivated. So I guess what I'd really love to ask you is, in your mind, are these fears of religious liberty, kind of this other side, quote unquote, coming after Christians, kind of misplaced, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think it's misplaced exactly. I think it's in a sense mistimed, and I'll explain what I mean. If one understands the issue of religious liberty, for much of American history, there was what Ross Alford, a New York Times reporter, called a soft hegemony of Protestantism. And that really went through to the middle part of the last century. And it wasn't a national church, right? So it wasn't like European establishment, but it mandated Bible readings and prayer in schools. There was anti-Catholic laws that were passed. And so it probably veered beyond what the founders would have been comfortable with. Yeah. Then in the 1960s, and David French, who's a friend of mine, a New York Times columnist, has written about this. So I'd urge people to read David on religious liberties. David is a lawyer and was involved in religious cases for much of the 1990s. So he writes about this and recounts it in I think, a very helpful way. But essentially, the argument is that the Warren Court began to dismantle this sort of soft Protestant establishment by blocking school prayer and scripture reading and so forth. And they probably veered too far, and that manifests itself up to and including the 90s, about denying religious organizations equal access to public facilities, which you were referring to. Since then, according to David, and this is my own reading of it as well, the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, has basically reestablished the balance, corrected the overcorrection, if you will, of the 60s and 70s, and the religious liberty proponents haven't lost a significant Supreme Court case in a decade and a half, according to David. And people today enjoy, people of faith, equal access to school facilities in ways that they didn't several decades ago, equal access to funds, and independence from non-discrimination laws. In other words, churches have the capacity to hire or not hire in ways that takes into account that they're religious institutions in the kind of way that would never work with public institutions. So I would say for the last decade and a half, certainly in terms of court decisions and the Supreme Court, the threat to religious liberty is not only not what a lot of Christians on the right say. We've probably never been in as good a place, and the religious liberty elements of equal access and independence from non-discrimination laws and so forth has probably never been stronger, at least in terms of the judicial decisions. So when you hear Christians today, and you will talk often incessantly about the persecution they're under, I'd say two things about that. The first is that has almost no awareness for the history of Christian persecution. You could hardly choose a better country or in a better time in the entire history of Christianity to be a Christian than in America today. So that's number one. Number two, there just seems to be no real awareness of all of the things that have been achieved and the kind of protections that people have. It should be grounds for celebration, or at least satisfaction, that Christians have the protections that they do. But I think there's an existential mindset in play, a lot of fear, and in a very odd way, I think for a lot of people who are Christians or claim to be Christians, fear and anger and bitterness and antipathy are kind of vivifying, almost life-giving to them. So where there is good news, for example, the last 30 years, the number of abortions has decreased at a remarkable rate. It's only gone up recently, and it wasn't during the Trump era. But prior to that, you had 30 years of almost nonstop progress and decrease of abortions. And yet very few Christians know about it and or celebrate it. And I think the same thing is roughly true about religious liberties. I think that they have a kind of martyr complex, persecution complex, and they've sold themselves on the narrative that they are the object of attack and persecution, and they want to convince other people, both their enemies and their friends, that's true. In fact, it's actually not.
Yeah, and that's incredibly helpful. Just to play devil's advocate, so to speak, I think the role of the courts in preserving religious liberty can't really be understated. And I could then see the case saying, well, former President Trump put in conservative Supreme Court justices, this is how we will continue to protect it going forward. And then, there's others who point out that Trump's just bamboozling evangelicals. He won't be any better for religious liberty than anyone else who's holding the Bible as a prop. He's selling a Bible that has the Constitution literally embedded with it. He's taken out pro-life planks from the RNC platform. This is just all a charade. How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. and it really depends on what angle that you're looking at. If you're a Christian of a certain type, MAGA world, Republican Christian today, then it would be perfectly valid and correct to say that Donald Trump played a key essential role in overturning Roe v. Wade. It wasn't him alone, because there were a number of other justices on the Supreme Court who were nominated by George W. Bush that overturned Roe. But there's also no question that the justices appointed by Trump, there were 3 of them, voted against Roe. And if that was high on your priority list of what you wanted him to do, he did it. And I don't think that it makes sense. It's not right to deny him that. I'd say that on the other side of that, just to stick with abortion for a moment, it's very important to distinguish between Supreme Court rulings and public policy on abortion and actually what's happening in terms of abortion, right? I mentioned earlier that abortions have gone up for the first time in 30 years. During the Trump era, they went up 8%. During the 2 terms of Barack Obama, the number of abortions dropped by 28%. So by the time Obama left office, the rate and ratio of abortions was at its lowest number since 1973, which is when Roe was decided. Now, that can mean a couple of things. It can mean, one, that there's no cause and effect, and so you can't credit Obama for the drop in abortions, or you can't blame Trump for the increase in abortions. But if that is the case, then you can't simultaneously make the argument that a vote for Donald Trump is going to reduce the number of abortions, and a vote for, say, Kamala Harris or a previous vote for Barack Obama would increase the number of abortions. The empirical record is undeniable. Over the last 50 years, abortions have dropped much more significantly during Democratic presidencies than Republican presidencies. Now, why that's happened is a question that one needs to explore. Did it have to do with policies, and which policies? Liberals would say that handing out contraceptives have helped reduce the number of abortions because it helped reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies.
Sure.
Conservatives would say no. The pro-life efforts, more initiatives to restrict abortions, that's played a role. But to say that Trump was pro-life in his policies doesn't mean that you actually made progress on abortion. And in addition to that, he's now basically jettisoned the pro-life position, the pro-life plank. Well, the pro-life plank in the Republican Party was taken out because of Trump in 2024. He's now using the language of the pro-choice movement. He's been flipping and flopping on the question of restrictions on abortion in Florida, the so-called heartbeat bill, right, where initially he said he thought it was too restrictive, and then there was some squawking from the pro-life movement. So now he's flipped around. Right. But he is at the national level, the Republican Party is basically neutral to pro-choice. I would say.
Yeah, it turns out everything is a lot more complicated, right? Than what one would be led to believe. I think if you're still looking at a high level at, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, it remains the case that, especially among white Protestants, they're heavily concentrated in the Republican Party. And so there's just, I think, a knee-jerk belief that that's going to be the party that's either going to be more favorable to Christianity in particular, or B, at least more favorable to religious liberty. And what would you want to hear from Harris and Trump, presuming we could take them at their word and believe what they say, about ensuring that America remains a place, as it was intended to be, of religious liberty and this kind of delicate balance between church and state?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to hear, from both of them would be an affirmation of the importance of religious liberties and an affirmation of the recent court decisions, and to be able to give voice to what's been achieved, which we talked about earlier. Equal access. That there's not going to be bias against people of faith, and there's not going to be bias for people of faith. They both have elements within their party and their movement that are on the extreme. For Harris, it would be secularists, who I think have a tropism that is critical of faith, and for Trump, it's the opposite. It's the worst manifestation of the Christian nationalist movement. Yeah. Trump himself, I think, is the embodiment of the worst sensibilities of the fringe. Harris is a little less clear. When she ran for president in 2019, she adopted some fairly extreme positions, but she was trying to appeal to the progressive wing of the party to get the nomination. She certainly has moved away from that now that she's the nominee for the Democratic Party, both policy-wise and also in the aesthetics of the campaign, if you will. So, I'd like each of them to give voice to certain convictions related to religious liberty, and if they could give thoughtful comments on the role and place of religion in American life, the good that it can bring, the dangers that inhere with faith getting involved in politics, that'd be great. Of course. You can mouth the words and during a campaign, and then the issue is governance. How do you actually govern? People have to make their own decision in terms of how much confidence they have in either one of them in this domain, in this arena. But I would say, honestly, whoever is president in the next term, whether it's Harris or Trump, I think we're in pretty good shape in the arena of religious liberties because of these court decisions, and I just don't envision anything happening anytime soon that would undo what's been achieved in terms of the protection of religious liberties.
Interesting. And so I normally ask my guests something that drives them crazy about campaign talking points related to any given issue. But I actually have something that drives me crazy on this issue, and it's something you wrote an Atlantic column on. And that's, I'm a person of faith. It's ascribing God's will to political outcomes that we want. Can you tell me why you wrote a column about this and what it said?
Sure. Yeah, it's the proximate cause of the column were the claims by a lot of people who are Trump supporters that during the assassination attempt, where Trump easily could have been killed and thankfully was not, that this was an act of God, and that God protected Donald Trump, intervened at that moment. And some took it beyond that and basically said, well, this is evidence that Donald Trump is chosen by God to lead our country. Not everybody said that, but some did. And I use that as an opportunity to do a meditation, a set of reflections on God's sovereignty. And I ask one question, which is, if you are arguing that God was the author of the protection of Donald Trump, saving him from being killed, was God also the author of the death that happened to the man in the crowd who, during the gunfire, protected his family and was killed? How do you think this through? Is it that God is only given credit for good things that happen, but he's off the hook for the bad things that happen? And how exactly do you understand God's sovereignty? And that was really the heart of the essay, which is my own reflection as a person of faith, to try and think through, what that means. And because I'm a Christian, I do believe that God is a personal God, that he's entered history. I mean, supremely in the birth and life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And then I wandered off into territory about prayers and do prayers change God's mind? Is it the kind of situation in which events that would otherwise have unfolded were altered because we've appealed to God? And so that was basically a personal reflection of trying to sort through how active God is and how we should understand it, and how do we understand, some of the evil that befalls. I should also say that the context. This has been an issue that's troubled me. I would say the misuse of God in world events, political events. Back in 2001, during the attacks on America by jihadists, Jerry Falwell Sr. and Pat Robertson argued that the reason that America was hit and New York was hit was because it was too accommodating on gay rights, too permissive on abortion, and a whole series of other things.
That.
And
with
that
the New Orleans hurricane, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. And Haiti, when there was an earthquake. So they came from a certain branch of Christianity that felt like there was cause and effect, and that God dealt with events today like God dealt with Israel in the Hebrew Scripture. And every time that there was something that, well, not every time, but many times that certain catastrophes would happen, they would take it to promote their narrative, their culture war narrative, to explain the mind and the heart of God. And that struck me then, and it strikes me now, as a very arrogant and dangerous thing to say. And basically the way that I ended the essay, Abby, was a reflection on the book of Job.
Well, it was a really thoughtful essay, and we'll include it at the bottom. And in some ways, you've kind of gotten into this a bit, but I want to talk about what you want to leave with voters as I think this issue in two parts, kind of for people of faith, of the Christian faith in particular, and as they're looking at it, candidates, kind of what's their posture to this election? Is it protecting our own rights first? Is it protecting something else? And then also for people who don't ascribe to religion, the religious nuns are at record levels in our country, kind of how they should think about the role of church and state in this election instead of maybe just a knee-jerk response to secularism.
Yeah, in terms of how to think about it, I mean, I think you have to make a threat assessment, which is what is the threat that Kamala Harris poses? What is the threat Donald Trump pose to the most important fundamental parts of the country? And I would say that Trump is a much more immediate and graver threat, because I think he is a threat to certain foundational principles and the Constitution and law and order. And I think his history, including January 6th, but not exclusive to that, is a demonstration of it. I think I think that public policy is somewhat less significant than in terms of how I would choose a president.
Oh, my heart, Pete! I love public policy.
Yeah, it's not irrelevant, and it matters. Right. But what I think is even more important is temperament, is disposition. And one of the reasons I say that, Abby, is because there are so many issues potentially that a president is going to face that are unexpected and that are not anticipated in a campaign. I mean, the administration that I worked in, the last one, the Bush White House, obviously 9/11 nobody saw, and it completely altered the trajectory of not just the Bush administration, but the country and the world. The other thing I would say for people of faith, and this I think doesn't get enough attention, is what is the effect on the Christian witness? That should matter a lot to people who claim to be followers of Jesus. And I think the damaging effects of the fusion between the religious right and Donald Trump has been enormous, because I think that they have embraced, in many cases, an ethic that's antithetical to Jesus. And they are projecting to the world not just an image but a reality of censoriousness, of judgment, of bitterness, of retribution, of anger, and of hate.
Well, and it seems like to me, as the share of religious nuns grows in our country, this might be some of the main exposure. Well, let me back up. Like, that 50 years ago would have maybe done less damage because people were, in general, still pretty exposed to Christian theology and the Bible. But as that has lessened, then yes, maybe this has become more of a false image of what Christianity actually is. And because there's not a reservoir of existing knowledge like there was to draw on.
Yeah, it's beautifully said. I completely agree with that. I mean, the world is watching, and what they're seeing is a kind of moral freak show, and the idea that people would want to join up to it is kind of preposterous in a lot of ways. I was on a Zoom conversation with a group of people. Some of them were people of the Christian faith, some not. We were talking about the He Gets Us campaign, which is this $1 billion effort.
It's out of Dallas, I think, actually, Pete.
Yeah, exactly. And you know about it. But these ads, and I think they're somewhat effective ads, which are trying to show Christianity and Jesus in a different, more loving and compassionate light. And so we were talking about it on the Zoom call, and I was asking people what they thought about it. And there were two comments that were notable. One was a person who said, the problem isn't Jesus. People don't dislike Jesus. It's his followers they hate. Now, that was one comment. The other comment was from a person who said they should rename it. The name of it shouldn't be He Gets Us. The name of it should be We Betrayed Him. And I think that goes to your point, which is to a watching world, seeing these people who on the one hand claim to be followers of Jesus, pious, talk about morality, and the notion that the Christians should be characterized by what Paul called the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. That's on the one hand the claim, the assertion, and then the reality are the insults, the hatred, the maliciousness, the antipathy that the Christians are embodying, and not just embodying, but justifying through their faith. So I think it's a grief of a kind, and it's done enormous damage. And I think Christians should be much more alert to that than they are.
Pete, I could talk with you all day about this, and few things are bigger than religion and politics, and so certainly talking about both of them at the same time is quite an undertaking indeed. And I really appreciate especially your foundational thoughts about church and state, because irrespective of what happens in November, this has been something Americans have wrestled with from the very, very beginning, and of course people well outside of America and our time have also. And so I think having a better understanding of what good looks like, what our own national heritage is just really helpful, not only for the next few months, but as a grounding going forward. So thank you so much, Pete, for your wisdom and generosity. Thankful for you.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Abby. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for your work in your ministry.
Listeners, we'll be back next week to sort through the presidential campaign promises and what America really needs. This podcast is running as part of the American Middle series at the Dallas Morning News. Please like us or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Abby McCloskey, and you've been listening to Beyond Talking Points.